Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am joined again by Terminal Philosophy on our 12th episode of the History of Warfare. Today we are going to cover the Peloponnesian Wars and the Anabasis. So basically, the first Peloponnesian War takes place in the 440s, late 440s, early 450s, and this is during the Golden Age of Athens. And we don't need to spend as much time on it because the real meat of the Peloponnesian War happens during the second, but it does help set up this position. So prior to the Persian Wars, Sparta was sort of the informal dominant Greek power. Athens was at best a second-rate power. With the rise of its maritime fleet and victory over the Persians at sea with Salamis and Malai, we see that the Athenians are now a first-rate power that have now accumulated lots of allies. And Sparta is perennially paranoid about the Helot revolts and in potential Helot revolts. And in fact, the first Peloponnesian War is sparked by Helot revolts. They ask the Athenians to back them up. Athens is like, yeah, sure, we'll help out. But in the long run, Sparta is suspicious and then tells the Athenians to go home, which is considered a diplomatic insult. Athens seeks to gain control over Megara and the Isthmus of Corinth and Boeotia. And they're initially unsuccessful. Sparta defeats them in 457, but then a year later they defeat the Boeotians, except for Thebes, and take over. And at this point, Athens seems to be in a dominant position. But then Athens overextends by sending resources and supplies to Egypt and Sicily, which we already mentioned, or Cyprus, Egypt and Cyprus, and fails miserably, losing much of its fleet and to the Phoenicians and the Persians. And so they then sue for peace with Sparta, having to give up much of their gains in Boeotia and the Isthmus of Corinth. And one of the lessons that many people think was learned, at least by Pericles, was the danger of overextension, right? When you're fighting a war in Greece, don't start a war in Egypt or Cyprus. And as we'll see later with Sicily, don't start a war there either. But basically, by the end of the first Peloponnesian War, I think it was around 445, no real changes have occurred. The fundamental tension between hegemony and Greece is left unresolved. And it's really just a time for the other two sides to build up their power base, build up their support. And this then leads us into the causes of the First Peloponnesian War, which, according to Thucydides, was the fact that Sparta feared the rise of Athenian power. Now, it is true that Athenian power had waned somewhat. They lost control of Boeotia and the Isthmus of Corinth, but nonetheless still had this tremendous potential due to their mercantile empire. And so also Sparta is, of course, concerned about internal Helot uprisings, which, of course, had occurred starting off the first Peloponnesian War. So they're always concerned about outside forces undermining their political structure based on slavery and of the Helots and this delicate balance of other Peloponnesian powers. Furthermore, the expiration of the truce with Argos in 421 BC, which could, if they allowed Athens to develop their power, could be exploited against Sparta later on. So, just as a survey again, the first Peloponnesian War doesn't solve anything. It was Athens' war to lose by overextending into Egypt and Cyprus, and this tension between hegemony ultimately creates the friction that will lead to the second Peloponnesian War. So, terminal philosophy, what are some of your thoughts on this period?
Right. Well, I think you properly summed it up as well as anyone could. I think really the tipping point, or the decisive moment for the first Peloponnesian War, was this sort of ill-fated expedition on the part of the Athenians to send troops and ships and logistics to Egypt, which ended in disaster. and that really destabilized much of the Aegean, which then sort of led to this sort of era of this attempt just before the truce to with Sparta to sort of reorganize the Aegean, as much of Athens' best men were lost in Egypt, and many of its resources were lost there. But as you stated, this really sort of set up the stage for kind of this 30 years period of peace, or so it was called, and then to sort of build up forces and to sort of reestablish political ties with other city-states, both among Sparta and Athens. But yeah, as we'll see, that really led to what was the necessary criteria for the Second Peloponnesian War. But really, it was a time for Athens of reorganization and rebuilding, as again, most of its naval assets were lost in Egypt. I remember trying to look up just exactly what the Athenians lost in Egypt, and again, there's some debate, but again, it was considered a naval disaster, and just basically a time for reorganization and rebuilding on the part of the Athenians, as well as the Spartans, but to a lesser degree.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if we look at the Peloponnesian War, we can basically, the Second Peloponnesian War, we can divide it into, roughly speaking, 4 periods, and these 4 periods are defined by the energetic leaders of each nation. So the first period would be from 431 to 427, where the Spartan leader Archidamus and the Athenian leader Pericles lock horns. That's the first generation, if you will. The second period is more broadly called the Archidamian War, which is from 427 to the Peace of Nicias in 421, where the 2 leading contenders are the Spartan general Brasidas and the Athenian leader Cleon and general Demosthenes. The third phase is what we might call the Sicilian period, or more broadly the Alcibiades period from 420 to 413, where Alcibiades seeks to create a coalition of the Peloponnesus and then later invade Sicily. And then the last period is what we might call the Ionian period from 413 to 404. And who dominates this period is the Spartan commander Lysander. Now, going to the lead up to the first period of 431 to 427, what we see is the Athenian alliance structure of the Delian League was increasingly centralized under the direct control of the Athenian city-state, where the treasury was moved from Delos to Athens of the Delian League. And part of the Athenian justification was, well, on the one hand, we've got the Persians we have to keep off your back, and the potential threat of Sparta, we need to be the deciders. We need to have this executive controller of the alliance in order to make it work. Because if we just if we delegated autonomy to these lower levels, it would be a looser alliance. It wouldn't be as effective. Whereas the Peloponnesian League was more consensus-based. Sparta could not as easily give direct oversight of its allies. And it basically was essentially 2 leagues, the Peloponnesian League in the Peloponnesus, where Sparta commanded the loyalty of Elias, Mantinea, and Corinth, and then the Boeotian League commanded by Thebes. And of course, they were divided by Athens. The Boeotian League was separated from the Peloponnesian League by Attica, which was controlled by Athens. And the basic premise of the war, in many ways, it begins kind of like World War I, where these interlocking alliances ultimately bring in the great powers. There was a naval trade dispute between Corcyra and Corinth, which eventually brought in both sides, because Athens was allied with Corcyra, and they wanted Athens to help break the stalemate. And Corinth was an ally of Sparta, and they wanted Sparta to help break the stalemate. And also there were in Chaldice, up near Macedonia, there were Corinthian colonies that were loyal to Athens, part of the Delian League, but they were of somewhat dubious loyalty, because would they support Corinth, their mother city, or would they support Athens due to the treaty obligations? So Athens was unsure about this, and because the Chaldean cities were along their grain shipment from the Black Sea. It was of strategic importance that Athens keep them loyal. And the one thing that we can learn from this early period is that minor powers have an incentive to escalate conflict if they're a part of a larger great power alliance structure. Because the great powers like Sparta and Athens kind of want to keep a balance here, and they benefit as long as there's a strategic equilibrium. Whereas the minor powers, especially if they're fighting each other, can't gain a decisive advantage until they bring in one of the great powers. So you kind of have this galloping Gertie effect. And then the broad strategic issue here is Athens never really seemed to develop a coherent strategy to defeat Sparta. Whereas from the very beginning, Sparta under Archidamus had a strategy to defeat Athens, and it was twofold, both of which revolved around gaining control of the sea, which during his reign he knew was impossible in the short term. It was a long-term goal. But by gaining control of the sea, Sparta could interdict grain shipments and blockade Athens, starving them out, and then also pry away allies from the Delian League by giving them support, both in supplies and in direct military intervention. And both Pericles and Archidamus open up with rather cautious strategies. Archidamus demonstrates in Attica burning crops, but not being able to besiege the long walls of Athens. In fact, I think they besiege either Megara or Plataea, and they failed to take it. And it shows you how poor Greek siege warfare was at the time. Archidamus just had to make a good show of force to make sure that the Spartans at home weren't going to accuse him of cowardice. And likewise, Pericles was generally very cautious as well, raiding Spartan cities along the coast, trying to interdict trade to Sparta, but generally not risking a direct assault. Some people think this was his lesson learned from the First Peloponnesian War, where there was a disaster in Egypt and Cyprus. Now then, the only real debate is what was Pericles' overall strategy? Was it one of just, not lose, right? As long as Athens doesn't lose, Athens wins? Or was he playing a longer game to sort of have a war of economic attrition against Sparta, but more importantly, her mercantile allies like Corinth? It's not really clear. There are arguments on both sides of the case for Pericles, but regardless, this first period is very cautious. Nobody's really happy about it on either side, Sparta or Athens. And the underlying, there's no decisive gains made. It's more of just sort of feeling out the strengths of each side.
Right. Well, the first thing I'd like to mention is, with this opening of the Second Peloponnesian War is really the sort of stark contrast between the land military doctrine of the Spartans and the sea doctrine of the Athenians. It was well established before the Persian invasions that Sparta had been known for its distinguished and high-quality hoplite infantrymen, as well as the various traditions and sort of social structures that made these Spartan hoplites a living thing in the first place. You and I discussed in the previous History of Warfare episode how the Athenians projected their sort of societal caste system into their military, particularly with their navy, with the various social classes taking their corresponding place, if you will, in one of the three layers of rowers in these hundreds of triremes that made up the Athenian navy. Everyone more or less knew, according to the speculation of Thucydides, that the Athenians, could not really stand toe to toe with the Spartans in an open field and be subjected to these various hardened tactics of the Spartan hoplites. And what you're kind of getting at in your opening statement is that, Athens, therefore, due to this sort of incoherent vision of this long-term strategy, sort of had to rely on allies politically and militarily to hopefully maximize their naval strengths and force sort of these battles out on the sea with the Spartans. As you mentioned, with this incoherent strategy, I tend to lean more on the side that Pericles was probably trying to sort of chip away at this weak Spartan economy, although they had a very robust, martial prowess that they had been known for and developed a reputation for. Sparta had never been known for this very dynamic sort of maritime economy that Athens was good at establishing. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got one belligerent, which is whose talent really resides in the cultivation of a broad and dynamic economy with, again, Athens just had a better talent at raising money and sort of playing the game of politics. And then you have the other belligerent, who's Sparta, who is just sort of kind of the more old school approach of being effective at waging war. However, not necessarily long drawn out wars of attrition, but rather decisive and large battles that would spell the end for their enemy. So as you mentioned, again, Pericles and Archidamus, this was a sort of a period of these opening conflicts where you're again just kind of testing the waters. And here we kind of see an example where Corinth and I forget the other name of the island, Carchira, thank you, where we here kind of see an example of third-party allies and auxiliary locations as sort of a way of starting a larger war between larger primary powers. This may not be the best example available, but in modern day, how you see the conflicts in Syria, most geopolitical analysts see Syria as a location of a proxy war, sort of between the United States testing the sphere of influence of Russia. So again, we kind of see allies being, we see sort of smaller allies and city-states who are beholden to larger powers, being forced to lock horns as a way of sort of getting a barometer or how bad or sort of intense a conflict might be. So that's sort of the first period of the Peloponnesian War, the Second Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, one other point to add is one of the things that makes the Peloponnesian War so long-lasting and difficult to resolve is the classic Greek strategy of seeking decisive battle, often by attacking enemies' farmlands to then bait them out to attack or force them to surrender due to starvation, wouldn't work, because Athens could supply its city by sea and be protected by the long walls, and Athens lacked the military prowess to invade the Peloponnesus and burn Spartan farms. And so it leads to this asymmetry of inability to find a strategic breakthrough. And really, the rest of the war is trying to find a way to do this. In the long run, Sparta's main advantage is decisive, a single unified leadership that is able to make carefully planned moves that will chip away at Athens' power, while Athens just kind of flails around and doesn't seem to have a clear strategic vision. Part of this is the fact that because Pericles had undermined the aristocratic checks on the Athenian constitution, it led to a sort of lopsided pro-poor position in the government. And so the aristocrats who kind of realized they didn't have a say were not as loyal as they otherwise might have been. And it led to this really, as we will see later with Alcibiades and Nicias, where Nicias represents the aristocracy and Alcibiades represents the people. They just can't get along anymore. And that's why you have this flip-flopping in policy, whereas Sparta tends to have a more coherent policy because there's not as much diversity in their political leadership. Now, the second period, what's often called the Archidamian War, has a lot of interesting components to it. But one of the most, starting off, we can look at Sparta's attempt to, well, first of all, Athens has a naval base at Naupactus, which was the result of former Helots from the First Peloponnesian War being settled there. And they were threatening Corinth. And so Sparta launches an attack on Naupactus, which is defeated at sea. But they also have a land offensive plan to undermine that. Ambracia attacks at Carnania, and they eventually support them to attack Naupactus. Now, at this point, Cleon is in charge with his man Demosthenes. And so Demosthenes is sent to reinforce Naupactus and at Carnania. to defeat the Spartans and their allies. In order to do so, he tries to do an end run and attack Boeotia through Lochirus, but fails because in that mountainous terrain, peltasts and skirmishers rout his forces. But learning from that defeat, he creates a package of diplomacy and trickery and incorporating peltasts and naval forces with his army in the sort of well-rounded military political strategy, defeating the Spartans decisively in Olpi. And so now the strategic initiative is ceded to the Athenians. And Cleon takes advantage of this by taking the island of Pylos. And Demosthenes takes Pylos. And so the Spartans then try to attack it. And in fact, they march troops up to the neighboring island of Sphacteria. But then the Athenian fleet comes in, isolates the two islands, and captures the Spartan warriors. Demosthenes fortifies Pylos, and Sparta is very concerned that Pylos might be a refugee for Helots. Now, it's not clear if that was Demosthenes' goal. I've looked at Thucydides, and I don't think he gives a direct account of why Demosthenes chose this location. But being right off the coast of Messenia, it is a natural stopping off point for Helots in a sort of 5th century underground railroad. And he does report that the Lacedaemonians were afraid. He says the Lacedaemonians, hitherto without experience of incursions or warfare of the kind, finding the Helots deserting and fearing the march of revolution in their country, began to be seriously uneasy. And in spite of their unwillingness to betray this to the Athenians, began to send envoys to Athens and to try to recover Pylos and the prisoners. So now Athens has this trump card, Spartan prisoners, and potentially a haven for Helots. And at this point, Sparta's over a barrel. And while, again, no decisive strategic breakthrough has occurred, Cleon is still in the saddle, pretty strong. He tries to then expand by invading Boeotia, but is defeated at Delium in 424 BC, in part because Demosthenes is not present at Delium, and he's Athens' best general at this point. Sparta, in order to kill two birds with one stone, threaten the Athenian grain shipments and remove potentially rebellious Helots, sends the general Brasidas with a small Spartiate contingent backed up by allies and Helots up to Macedonia to attack Chaldice. And he's successful beyond everybody's imagination. Nobody expected Brasidas to be this successful. Athens is like, wow, this is going real bad. So they send up Cleon to fight to regain much of the territory. And in this inconclusive struggle, both Brasidas and Cleon are killed. With the two hawks being killed, the dove Nicias and then his counterparts in Sparta sign the Peace of Nicias, where they're supposed to transfer territory. Athens is supposed to give back Pylos, and Sparta is supposed to give back the cities in Chaldiki, neither of which happens, in part because nobody trusts each other. But Sparta gets their soldiers back, which in my mind was insane and treasonous on the part of Nicias. The Athenians should have kept those guys all the way. So they should have kept the Spartans as a impossible trump card to keep Sparta at bay. But at this point, both sides are exhausted. They've tried to probe for other weak points, whether it's in northwestern Greece or northeastern Greece or Boeotia. And again, no decisive victories are made. But the strategic initiative is in Athens' hands. So it's a stalemate, but it's a stalemate in Athens' favor. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, at this point, after the death of Pericles, this is where you sort of get a change in overall strategy on the part of Athens, where Pericles sort of had this semi-conservative, quasi-isolationist, defensive sort of a strategic posture, and then this changes after his death with the Athenians sort of probing and going on the offense in various places. And again, as you sort of summarized, again with the two generals dead, with Cleon's death, again you have sort of the Athenians sort of leaning on their allies, and also really attempting to strike Sparta in its weakest places. But really, you don't have any major gains made either by one side. But again, as you mentioned, this is just sort of a probing for weak places anywhere where they where it could possibly be anticipated. But as you mentioned, also Sparta does get its troops back towards the end of this period, and then again, this is just kind of sort of leading up to the what I guess we could consider somewhat the third era of the war, which is the Sicilian expedition, and sort of this attempt, these conflicts centered around Syracuse. But yeah, I think again, so a kind of a second era of stalemates that happened.
Yeah, the third period maybe would be better to be called the Alcidibian period, is based on the leadership and characteristics of Alcibiades. Part of the problem here is Alcibiades is one of the most treacherous, roguish figures in ancient Greek history, willing to sell himself out to the highest bidder no matter who he is. And this is going to bode ill for Athenian policy, since because he's the golden boy of the populist party, is going to have the most clout in making Athenian decisions. His first attempt to break the deadlock, trying a new strategy, is take advantage of troubles in the Peloponnesus. The Peace of Nikias wasn't very popular with Sparta's allies, who were still in principle fighting Athens. So Elis, Megara, and Corinth are sort of like, yeah, we're going to leave the Peloponnesian League. And Sparta's, not really interested right now in reinvading to acquire control over them. Furthermore, in 421, the treaty with Argos expires, and so Alcibiades seeks to build a sort of political alliance with Elis, Mantinea, and Argos in order to directly confront and defeat the Spartans in the Peloponnesus. Now, the strategy seems well conceived, and it might actually have worked had there had not been a shift, as there often was, in Athenian political decision-making, which, in part because they were afraid of the influence that Alcibiades was gaining, denied him the troops he needed to send to back up his allies in the Peloponnesus. And so the alliance, while formed, the Athenian contingent doesn't really show up. And so Sparta is then, in 418 of the Battle of Mantinea, crushes this incipient alliance, and Athens loses a golden opportunity to upend the Peloponnesian power structure. But the next stage then is, it would appear that all throughout Greece, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's probing other regions, Athens seems to be out of strategic options. And Alcibiades thinks that, hey, maybe going to Sicily is a good idea. Maybe we should go to Sicily to gain support there. Now, there is a debate on what Athens' overall goal was. Was it to conquer Sicily? Which on the face of it is an absurd idea, given that Sicily is as large as the Peloponnesus. And I had two great powers there, Carthage to the far west at Agrigentum, and Syracuse in the east. So there was really no in principle way Athens could have conquered Sicily. Now, one intriguing idea is that Alcibiades didn't want to necessarily conquer Sicily, but do a repeat of his Peloponnesian strategy of gaining allies and influence in the region to then draw on for the broader war. We'll never really know, because Alcibiades was later recalled from the expedition to stand trial for impiety against the gods, in which case he then flees to Sparta. But the whole Athenian expedition to Sicily was sort of ill-conceived from the beginning. Nicias opposes it, and he's the leader of the conservative party. And in order to dissuade the Athenians, exaggerates the amount of resources they would need to take the island, hoping to discourage them from sending them in the first place. But given the sort of pro-war influence in Athens and the optimism that it has of its own ability, they go for it. They say, yeah, we're going for it. And to make it even more ridiculous, they put Nicias in charge of the expedition, a man who's staked his entire political career on opposing it. And when Alcibiades leaves to serve Sparta because he doesn't want to stand trial in Athens, and then tells the Spartans how to win, the whole expedition should have just been called off at that point, but it wasn't. And so Alcibiades lands. He doesn't really make any decisive actions. He just kind of dithers. And he begins the process of circumambulation, where he builds walls around Syracuse to blockade it, with the Athenian fleet blockades it at sea. But he doesn't build the walls as quickly as he ought to. And due to the advice of Alcibiades, the Spartans send an ambassador, Gylippus, what we might call a what would happen in the United States in the 20th century. We sending an advisor to organize the defense of an ally. And Sparta was very effective historically at this kind of indirect warfare, sending advisors to allies. And the Sicilians, the Syracusans, who had been sort of caught on the back foot, were now energized and actively confronted the Athenians, who had taken a position on a plateau overseeing Syracuse. And Gylippus and the Spartans, with their Syracusan allies, overthrew the Athenians, threw them off the plateau, built counter walls to then begin to encircle the Athenians. Nicias sends a letter back to Athens saying we should call it off or give me more reinforcements. Athens like, yeah, we'll give you more reinforcements. Now they do send Demosthenes, which should have been a good thing, but in a night attack trying to regain the heights over Syracuse, he's killed. And at this point, after squandering something like 10,000 soldiers and 400 ships, the Athenians are just cut to pieces. And it's the greatest disaster in classical Greek warfare ever. And the Athenians are crippled and the Spartans are buoyed tremendously. And two things happen that make the Archidamian strategy possible now. Naval assets from Syracuse and gold from Persia. Now that Athens has fundamentally crippled itself, all the other enemies of Athens smell blood in the water. And they start joining Sparta, giving Sparta support, direct or indirect, to bring Athens down. And this is really the turning point. At the end of the Archidamian Wars, Athens was in a strategically dominant position. At the end of the Alcibian period, Athens is on the ropes. And so this whole period where this demagogue Alcibiades was in charge of Athenian policy just completely destroyed Athens. And the dithering, quasi-treasonous behavior of Nicias, it didn't help either. Athens just had a complete lack of good leadership during this period, and it fatally weakened their cause in this war.
Right. Well, again, Athens going on the offense without having any true sort of offensive vision, without pulling out anything off in a long-term sense, really proved to be disastrous. So what we had earlier with the First Peloponnesian War of a disastrous expedition into Egypt, you could argue that what happened in Sicily was probably twice as worse, if not more, because again, it was sort of this half-planned, sort of half attempt to see what support could be sort of garnered over in Sicily. But then again, it turns out to be a disaster. And as you mentioned, I think this is where you could argue that Sparta really started to shine in terms of how it managed to send advisors to other allies rather than having to spread its elite forces, who were again in high quality but not in extremely high numbers. So rather than spreading forces thin, they sort of capitalized on sort of this military advisory sort of tactic, which I think eventually started to clearly benefit them. And then also, of course, from this period of 414 to 404, you've got this period of Achaemenid support for Sparta, where Darius II started to, this is where the support, the financial support of gold from Sparta really just start to come in. And so, again, I think, you and I spoke earlier how this was an interesting twist of where Greek brothers, both Sparta and Athens, you've got Sparta sort of culturally betraying Athens in receiving support from their sort of what could be considered an immortal enemy of Persia. So that's very fascinating. But again, at this point, I think that we'll see that Athens really does lose the offensive initiative. Again, with such a disastrous loss in Sicily, both with naval and land assets, there's nothing really that Athens can do. But now it's on its sort of back foot, and this is where Lysander really sort of enters the stage, and this is sort of the closing phases. We're now starting to enter the fourth closing phase of the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, and what we see here is the couple of points are important. Both Syracuse and Persia are ultimately unable to live up to some of their obligations. Carthage, beginning in 410, makes strong moves into Sicily, which then siphons off most of Syracuse's assets and resources. And the perennial Egyptian rebellion siphons off Persian direct military intervention, though Persia does finance the Spartan fleet. And at this point at sea, Sparta really can't lose. Because it doesn't matter how many naval battles Sparta loses, they can always raise a new fleet with Persian money. Athens is increasingly pinched. And eventually, Spartan commanders are able to pry away Athenian allies in the Aegean, in Ionia, and under the bold, decisive leadership of Lysander, continually push the Athenians at sea to gain a chokehold on the supply lines. And ultimately culminating in the Battle of 405 BC at Aegis Ptolemais, Lysander is able to defeat the Athenians at sea. And at this point, with the empire in tatters, the Delian League revolt in open rebellion, and Sparta are having a chokehold on their supply lines and having a rebellion of oligarchs, Athens surrenders. And this gets into the period of the 30 tyrants. But what we see in this final Ionian period is that a combination of calm strategic planning, putting pressure all along the Athenian Empire at once, coupled with the decisive action of Lysander, coupled with the infinite purse of Persia, was enough to finally break the Athenians. And at this point, we see the beginning of Spartan hegemony in Greece.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, Lysander has the decisive naval victory at Aegis Ptolemais, and which I believe was in the Hellespont. And of course, this is the end of sort of the Athenian, and you have open revolts from different cities-states of the Delian League, and again, this is kind of shows how really on the part of the Athenians, if you don't have a well planned out offensive strategy mixed with sort of bad politics at home, then of course you're going to have these disastrous misadventures far from the Peloponnesus. Again, just look no further than Egypt or Cyprus or Syracuse. So again, Athens could have benefited from just simply kind of waiting for the right moment to strike and leaning on its allies, but they got a little too adventurous. And again, I think probably the hubris of Athenian politics led them to believe that they could defeat Sparta in these decisive victories well outside of the really the Aegean, which you would think is kind of bizarre, sending troops so far away from home to try and garner support in places like Syracuse. And again, Sicily, as you mentioned before, is roughly the same size as a large portion of the Greek mainland. So I think really Lysander, by the time Lysander was taking charge, and you have this flow of gold and silver from Persia, the Athenians really couldn't do much about it. They couldn't replace triremes quite like the Spartans could. And again, the Spartans could afford to have naval disasters, and they certainly did several times in these opening phases of the war. But then, again, things are concluded at Aegis Ptolemais, and here's and I don't know if I'm jumping the gun a bit, but here's kind of where the famous Xenophon's Anabasis sort of enters the fold here, where after Sparta does take over, it's not too long after that when you have, of course, the sort of famous dispute between Cyrus II and his brother, who both wanted to be king, and his brother. I apologize. What's his brother's name? The starts with an A.
Artaxerxes.
Artaxerxes. Thank you. So this leads, of course, to the famous expedition where Cyrus II recruits the army of the 10,000, as it's known, or it's really about 13 to 14,000, where you have 10,000 Greek hoplites that are hired by Cyrus II to go challenge his brother Artaxerxes. And this leads, of course, to the famous route of when they start, of course, in the Aegean, and then they march in several places across Asia Minor to places like Ipsos and Dana and Tarsus, eventually to the last northeastern port of the Mediterranean at Issos, where at this point, again, the only reason that Cyrus II was able to gather this force to go challenge his brother deep within Persian territory was the promise of gold. Cyrus II was sent off to Asia Minor to be sort of act as this viceroy, and to be kind of sort of this governor figure. But again, I think he thought that he deserved to be the guy in charge. And so he does end up recruiting this mercenary force of 10,000 Greek hoplites, plus about 3,000 to 4,000 other lighter infantry, as well as quite a long caravan of supply, just logistical support. But then, of course, he makes the famous crossing of the Euphrates, where the Euphrates, there was a pontoon bridge that was built by his brother Artaxerxes, but and he destroyed it behind him because he knew he was being pursued by his brother Cyrus II. He destroyed the pontoon bridge, but the Euphrates at that point, when the river should have been flowing from heavy with water, it was actually very shallow, and the army was able to cross with relative ease, which was sort of, I think it was interpreted at the time as that the gods were in support of this expedition. And this, of course, leads to after the crossing of the Euphrates by Corsote, they then march 13 to 14 more days down until is known as the famous Battle of Canaxa, where Cyrus II, in his own sort of hubris, is killed. But through all of the tactical confusion and the confusion of the battlefield, the 10,000 Greeks were ordered by Cyrus before the battle began to actually take up the center position of the formation of the army. But the commander at the time of the 10,000 disobeyed this because he enjoyed having the Euphrates to his far right wing, meaning that his the right side of his phalanx formation wouldn't be exposed to attack from cavalry or from the famous scythed chariots. And so what ended up happening is that the 10,000 ended up taking position on a hill. And the next day they heard that Cyrus II was killed because he got a little too sort of egotistical with pursuing his brother, who Artaxerxes was doing these sort of feigned retreats type of a tactic, which ended up disorganizing the entire formation of Cyrus's the Second Army. And then, of course, begins sort of this Homeric, difficult adventure home for the 10,000. This is where the Persians agree that they can, head northward. They end up crossing the Tigris and end up heading northward into modern day Turkey, like parts of eastern Turkey. And this is where they ended up kind of being double crossed again by the Persians, and they're pursued by Tissaphernes. And through several acts of assassination, what ends up happening is that Xenophon, well, the army of the 10,000 loses its top commanders in sort of this assassination event. And the Greeks, in sort of a classical Athenian fashion, they meet and they discuss, and as Herodotus would say, many viewpoints had to be heard so that the best could be utilized. And so Xenophon ended up being the commander of the rear guard of the army, while as they entered these mountains of modern day Turkey, there were sort of these autonomous sort of tribes that lived in the hills that neither the Persians nor the Greeks or any other powers that resided in Anatolia really had any control over. I forget the name of the mountains, but it's in like southeastern Turkey, along the Tigris River. And as they go further north, they are both pursued by Tissaphernes, and they're also being harassed in sort of this, ambush style tactics from these tribes, and they end up losing quite a few men. And then they also come upon, again, this is in about midwinter, you have to remember, they end up coming upon a crossing in about, this is about several, I would say about 400 to 500 miles, probably about, well, more like 300 miles south of the southern coast of the Black Sea, where they come upon a crossing where they are met by another Persian army. And at this point, they had been harassed both by Tissaphernes and these tribes. And then they find a crossing, which again, the 10,000 divide their forces into two. The first half of the forces fight the Persians sort of head on, while the second set of forces, Xenophon's forces, use the crossing as a way to make sort of a classic pincer move. And then as the Persians kind of see the writing on the wall, many of them surrender, many of them were killed, and I think the majority of that army ended up retreating. But what ended up happening is that after several more difficult conflicts with these tribes, they end up on the southern coast of the Black Sea, where they're sort of they're screaming the word for sea in Greek, and that's at the sort of the modern day. Well, I think the city is called the Trapezius or something like that. And from there, they're able to gather ships, and they're able to eventually sail home. But that is sort of kind of the cliff notes of Xenophon. But what can be derived from Xenophon is that Xenophon, also being primarily being known as a good commander and sort of like the right man at the right time, he was also a student of Socrates. And after this long sort of difficult Homeric adventure home, he ends up finding out that Socrates was executed by the Athenian court, and he sort of never lived. He felt a great deal of shame for this and never being able to live it down, in the sense that he should have been there for his master in his time of need. But again, he was sort of off on these misadventures for Cyrus II. I don't know what your thoughts are on the Anabasis.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to investigate here, but I think some of the key points here are the decapitation of the Greek leadership by treachery would have worked on a Persian army if you gotten rid of the leaders. Like, for example, Plateo, when Mardonius was killed, the army collapsed. And no doubt the Persians probably assumed that would happen with the Greeks. But the Greeks have this democratic or consensus government concept where they just vote their own people into authority if they had lost their effective command and control. And we'll see this also with the United States and Germany in the 20th century. If commanding officers are eliminated, the Germans and the Americans often have the ability of essentially voting from their own ranks or choosing from their own ranks replacements to use as a sort of stopgap until more official replacements have been chosen for these commanding officers. And it shows you the sort of robustness of the polis. The polis wasn't just an idea for cities. It was apparently an idea for an army on the march. And that gave them a tremendous ability to overcome adversity and resist these kinds of issues. Now, at the time of the Anabasis and beyond, this was seen as an inherent superiority in Greek arms over Persia. It's difficult to envision a Persian Anabasis coming out of Greece. Now, of course, given how modern historians have tended to take a more pro-Persian stance for largely political reasons, this is not considered acceptable. But I think it's the obvious reading of the events, from Marathon in 490 up until, the Anabasis and beyond. We have about a century of uninterrupted Greek military success over Persian arms. The fact that Artaxerxes did not crush the Greeks in the Anabasis shows the power that the Greeks had. Some people might argue, well, Artaxerxes didn't have to. Well, maybe that's true, but it still would be a huge loss of face to not be able to defeat these invaders from far-flung corners of the world in the heart of your empire. It doesn't look good. And in fact, Macedonians would say, hey, look what happened with the Anabasis. They weren't even prepared for an invasion. They weren't properly organized. Philip and Alexander, once properly organized, were able to more than repeat the success of the Anabasis and toppled the entire Persian Empire. And then I do think that the lessons thus far with Greece versus Persia are that due to a combination of training, equipment, motivation, and political leadership, the Greeks had an edge over Persia. Consistent success is not the result of luck. It's the result of systems that are in place that give one side a key advantage over another. And I think we've already mentioned in our discussion of hoplite and naval warfare, some of those key aspects of Greek society gave them advantages over the Persians. And really, I guess the postscript to the Anabasis is that many of the troops were still in Asia joining the invading army of Agesilaus II, who's fighting Persia. And then the next episode, we'll get into that and the Corinthian War and the Spartan hegemony. But sort of ending with the Spartan hegemony, is there anything else you'd like to add, terminal philosophy?
Other than just that, you nailed it pretty well earlier, where, again, you have this, despite sort of Greek brothers fighting other Greek brothers, you have this well-established pattern now where you have a sort of uniquely Greek military doctrine being developed in the Aegean, whereas the Persians are sort of left to deal with the challenges of maintaining a largely sort of what you could sort of characterize as an undisciplined horde. Yes, of course, you have the immortals, but again, you've got sort of this sort of unfortunate trend in modern academics that sort of take a pro-Persian stance for largely political reasons. But really, the Greeks were consistently successful against the Persians for reasons of just superior systems and the ability to strike at the right place at the right time with the right sort of assets, rather than just sort of taking this classic Persian approach, which is just gather a massive army sort of out of anger and out of hubris, and then just go in there and then just clean everything out. Well, yes, the Persians in their invasion of Greece did destroy Athens, but again, they hardly ever, the majority of that massive 300,000 man army never even made it back to Persian territory. Again, this was just due to poor planning, and really this massive horde was sort of at the mercy and at the emotional whims of a sort of an egotistical leader, whereas you see more of a disciplined approach on the part of the Greeks. It's this sort of fascinating overlap between societal social structures overlapping with the military organizations. And so this is sort of where you see an interesting synthesis between the two, and forcing military institutions to operate more like well-functioning parts of Greek society. There's probably a better way to summarize that, but that's more or less kind of what is starting to happen here. But yeah, as we'll see later on, once Greeks can sort of agree and sort of with one another on sort of on a regional level, and with the rise of Philip and Alexander, once this organization is truly mastered, well, then I mean, they ended up taking the entire. They'll end up destroying the entire Persian Empire and going as far as the Hindu Kush. So, but of course, we'll get to that in due time. But thanks for having me, as always.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming on. And again, remember to like, subscribe, share, and hit the notification bell. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.